Good morning. I don't know about you, but it's hard for me to believe that this is the last Sunday in September. I hope all of you have had a great week, and I'm glad that you joined in today. Last Sunday, we left off in chapter 7 of Isaiah with Ahaz, the king of Judah, refusing to trust God for protection from Assyria and some smaller nations that pose threats to that country. In the chapters following last week's study, leading up to today's lesson, Isaiah continued to tell of God's plan to punish and then restore Israel and Judah. The small nation of Judah wondered how any restoration could be possible with all the powerful nations around them. But you have to remember, they were surrounded by pagan nations, and even though this was God's chosen people, they were influenced by other cultures. The common belief was that the gods that they worshiped were territorial, and that meant that their power was only over their home turf. And when that power would fade as they moved away from their homeland. And the people believed that when they were at war, the various gods were also at war. And if that was the case, then gods could win or gods could lose. So just like that would be just like the nations they sponsored. So it was tempting for the entire nation of Israel, the north and the south, that they would put their God in the same category as the many other gods in the surrounding regions. In response to this fault, Isaiah also prophesied about future events that would involve these pagan countries in the cities. There were various chapters that were specifically mentioned: Babylon, Assyria, Philistia, Moab, Damascus, Cush, Egypt, Edom, and Arabia. They are in the chapters following the one that we studied last week. Each of these places were specifically mentioned in Isaiah's messages. Now, they were called oracles, and these oracles against the other nations, or the judgments on the nations, were written in chapters 13 through 23. They address the downfall of the named nations, but the message was sent to Judah, and it was heard by the people of Judah, and it was intended for the people of Israel. The messages were to serve as warnings that if they acted like pagan nations, then God could treat them just as a pagan nation. So our lesson today is at the end of these oracles, and it begins in chapter 13. And verses 1 through 7 aren't included in today's lesson, but they describe the fall of Tyre. This was a Phoenician city. It was in the country of Phoenicia, but it was on a port on the Mediterranean Sea, and it was the center of trade and power on the Mediterranean Sea. It was just north of Israel. It was a major port for trade. It was an extremely wealthy place. They had a great deal of influence on the world as they knew it, as much of the world that they knew at the time. It was the home of skilled seafarers, and it was known for worshiping the god Baal. It was a strongly fortified area, had a large population, and a great fleet of ships. And it seemed to be a permanent fixture of the world, and it was hard for the Israelites, hearing Isaiah's prophecy, to fathom its downfall. A modern day comparison might be the total destruction of New York City, which is a trade center, and it's a route for in and out of the country, and the effect on the world that if that should happen with the stock markets and the transportation routes. If you magnify the disaster from 9/11, the attacks there, but you multiplied it so that it included the entire city, then you would have a taste of what Isaiah was predicting for this ancient world when he predicted the fall of Tyre. So now we're going to start in chapter 23, verse 8. Who hath taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers are the honorable of the earth? Now, depending on the version, the translation that you read, it may read just a little bit different, but I'm going to read the one that's included in the Sunday School Quarterly. But in this verse, Isaiah begins with a rhetorical question of basically, who can do this to Tyre? And he knew all the people there hearing this prophecy were probably asking the same thing. Who's able to do this? Because obviously, With the refusal of the offer that God made of giving signs in return and trusting Him, then He would provide safety for them. They wondered, because of the influence of the countries around, if God was even in charge of Judah's situation. But Isaiah was making it clear that God was in charge of everything. It's not like Isaiah didn't realize the standing that Tyre held with the world. He affirmed it as a bestower of crowns, meaning that the wealth and power of that city could make or break the success of kings in neighboring countries. Tyre didn't have a strong military base, it didn't need it, and it did not have much political sway. But what they did own was the corner market on their broad international economic impact. The merchants were treated like royalty, which is not the honor that's usually given to that group of people. Everywhere in the world, Tyre's merchant class was known and highly respected. So the question was, who can tear down this powerhouse? In the next verses, Isaiah answers that question for them. So we're going to read now verses 9 through 10. The Lord of hosts hath proposed it, to stain the pride of all glory, and to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. Pass through thy land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more strength. Isaiah emphasized that God would orchestrate the fall of Tyre. It was an impressive place. The people were extraordinary, and they and their business associates felt that they were insurmountable, but they were no match for God. Their pride instigated their downfall. They had become haughty and seemingly self-reliant, and they would face punishment for failing to recognize the true source of their wealth and power. Tarshish was a trade center on the western banks of the Mediterranean Sea, and it was about as far as you could get in the trade world. And Tyre was on the east coast, of course, so it was just one area. Tarshish was just only one area that would be highly impacted by Tyre's fall. The ships from Tarshish would have no place to dock because Tyre would be completely destroyed and trading would no longer be an option. The people hearing this prophecy understood the image of the flooding of the Nile. But of course, the Nile had to flood for agricultural to flourish because the land around it was so dry, and the silt from the flood waters fed the crops. It was sort of like a natural fertilizer. But Isaiah was saying in this that the intensity of the people leaving Tarshish would be comparable to the flooding of the Nile, except their leaving was not for a good cause. There would be no work for them, no way to purchase staple goods in the port city of Tarshish, because there would be no longer any trade from Tyre. The people were fleeing the city in an attempt to survive. Tarshish was just one of the trade centers dependent upon Tyre, but the warning was an example for all of the trade centers that depended on Tyre for their supplies. Now we'll continue with verses 11 through 12. He stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms. The Lord hath given a commandment against the merchant city to destroy the strongholds thereof. And he said, Thou shalt no more rejoice, O thou oppressed virgin, daughter of Zidon. Arise, pass over to Chittim. There also shalt thou have no rest. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing these words correctly or not, but you give it a try. If it's different, you just say it the way you want to say it. The Phoenicians, where Tyre was a part of Phoenicia, they were considered some of the finest sailors of the world. As undisputed masters of the sea, they maintained control of most of the shipping traffic. But the picture here of God stretching out his hand over the sea is one that shows his supreme power and control. The sailors also believed that the gods of the sea created chaos on the waters and that they were the foe to fear and face. Isaiah made it clear that the God of Judah controls the sea and everything else, and he is so powerful that kingdoms will shake, referring to the kingdom of Canaanite being destroyed in the past. And now he's given a commandment against this merchant city. With the fall of Tyre, surrounding nations would realize that nothing is forever except God. Isaiah compared Tyre to an oppressed virgin who was once happy and free without a care in the world until she was beaten and raped, or maybe both. But her joy then was gone, just as the joy of these ruined cities would be gone. Sidon was also mentioned in these scriptures. Both Tyre and Sidon were important cities to the Phoenicians, and some of the people of both places would try to escape to the island country of Chittim or Cyprus. But they would find no rest there either because they could not outrun God. So now we're going to verses 13 through 16. Behold the land of the Chaldeans. This people was not, till the Assyrian founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness. They set up the towers thereof, they raised up the palaces thereof, and he brought it to ruin. How, you ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. And it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre shall be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. And at the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as a harlot. Take a harp, go about in the city, thou harlot that hast been forgotten. Make sweet melody, sing many songs, that thou mayest be remembered. If the Phoenicians still thought that their ports would never fall, then they needed to be reminded of the land of the Chaldeans, also known as Babylonia, because of the capital city was Babylon. They used to be the controlling nation in the Middle East, but by the time of Isaiah, it no longer existed as a ruling power. God had used the Assyrians as instruments of judgment against that nation, and he would also use Assyrians and other nations as instruments against Tyre and Sidon. Tyre was a fortress with tall walls, but they would not stand against God. Isaiah referred again to the ships from Tarshish as if they were people. He said they would be moaning because of no safe harbor on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. The judgment of these nations being foretold was also a warning to the nations of God's people. Powerful and wicked nations might dominate the world for a time, but God will eventually use all of them to advance his purposes for his creation. And the time of Tyre's downfall was not put on a calendar, but it would certainly be executed when God allowed it. And at that time, the powerful, the proud, the wealthy city would become a dim memory in history. It would be forgotten for 70 years, which was about the expected lifespan. A lot of kings didn't live that long, but that was a number of completion, I guess you might say. And then Isaiah sang a song. And maybe this song was one that the people knew, but it was a song about a prostitute who, that was symbolizing Tyre, who was well beyond her prime. Her farmer clientele no longer desired her, so she would go out into the street playing and singing songs in order to gain attention that way. After God's judgment of Tyre, former trading partners would not be interested in doing business with the fallen city, just like her clientele were no longer interested in her. Power and influence would be lost, and the city would have to do whatever in order to get just a morsel of the attention that it once had. The last scriptures for today are 17 through 18, so we'll go to that now. And it shall come to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and she shall turn to her hire and shall commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. And her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. It shall not be treasured or laid up, for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord, to eat sufficiently and for durable clothing. Isaiah now offered a glimmer of hope. After the 70 years of Tyre being forgotten, it would be restored. And you would think that it would be restored at that time, that it would come back with a different passion than it had before the 70 years, but that was not the case. They returned to business as usual and their old materialistic ways. But God redirected their profits for his purpose. The tables were turned on it. Cities in the past that had supported Tyre as a center for trade, now Tyre would be supporting those cities. The wealth it gained was not going to be stored or saved for its purposes, but it was going to be used to support those who served the Lord in Jerusalem, to provide for the priests for their food and their clothing. God controls the rise and fall of nations and powers. He holds sinful people, rulers, and nations accountable. But he also, through Jesus, has provided the way for us, for sinners, that's all of us, to be forgiven and restored to a new life of obedience and hope. Isaiah's words in these scriptures should prompt us to ask ourselves some very serious questions. First of all, do we put our trust in structures or institutions of some sort? Are we sensitive to God's hand in our lives? Do we ask him to teach us his ways in tough times and in times of blessings? Or do we, like the Phoenicians, forget from where our blessings flow? Have we turned our backs so far on God that he, in his justice, could destroy our city or our homeland one day? I want to thank you for joining in today. I pray that we take these lessons and we store them in our hearts and in our minds so that we have a resource to pull from in our daily lives. I pray that you keep safe and help keep others safe until next week. Thank you.